I will never forget where I was on February 24th, 2022. I was on my way from Geneva to Kiev to attend an emergency supervisory board meeting. We decided 2 days earlier. So on February 23rd, I bought a plane ticket from Geneva to Kiev through Warsaw. And my plane was supposed to land in the night of the 24th at 1:20 in the heart of Kiev. I was supposed to have this beautiful view of Kiev in the night. And for any reason, several hours after I bought my ticket, I received a notification that the plane was delayed and we would be taking off from Warsaw later in the night, 2:15. At 2:30, I was sitting in the plane, reading my Twitter feed, and I understood that I'm probably going to hell, and much earlier than anticipated. And for any reason, reason is obvious. After 30 minutes in the flight, the captain announced that the Ukrainian airspace was closed, and we would be turning back to Warsaw. And so I spent my whole night in Warsaw witnessing how all events unfolded, not knowing whether I would see again my supervisory board colleagues or friends in Ukraine. And then the next day, this is how Kiev was looking. Scores of people evacuating through the big axis, either by road, and not everyone made it, unfortunately, or by train. Crowds of people at the main train station evacuating the city, leaving behind their sons, fathers, brothers, uncles, etc. And you might ask yourself how I ended up in the supervisory board. My name is Dimitri Shishlo. My name comes from my father, who is Russian. He immigrated from Soviet Union in 1977. My mother is French. I was born in France. I live in Switzerland for the past 14 years. And at some point, I used to live in Ukraine from 2004 to 2009. And I was appointed to this supervisory board in 2019 at the age of 40. And I really hope that I didn't reach my highest level of incompetence, according to Peter's principle. Before I explain further, just a brief short overview of the banking sector in Ukraine. At one point in the time, there used to be 189 banks in Ukraine, and the vast majority were what we call pocket banks. Pocket banks are established by businessmen who run several businesses to collect the depositors' money and finance their operations with the depositors' money. Of course, there is no risk management here. There is no proper governance behind. And sometimes the bank disappears, and the owner disappears with the money, or the bank gets bankrupt, and a lot of vested interest when people in lending. So this created mistrust in the banking sector. And in 2014, where the war started between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, the local currency, the hryvnia, was heavily devaluated. Hence, a lot of banks fell into bankruptcy, but not only small pocket banks, but much bigger ones. And at this point, the state and the central bank decided to implement a deep, heavy reform of the banking sector, implementing a lot of liquidity ratios, Basel II principles, and cleaning the the banking sector. So from 180 banks in 2014, now we have 67 of them. However, out of those 67, 4 are state-owned. And they account for 43% of the banking sector, which is quite huge. It represents a systemic risk for the country. And in 2019, under the pressure of the international financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the EBRD, the IFC, the EIB, etc., the state decided to change the corporate governance of its state-owned banks to ensure they have more stability better, let's say, long-term overview. And instead of having 15 government nominees as supervisory board members, and in fact, those supervisory board never met and never gathered for the past, before we arrived, so for the past almost 30 years, they decided to appoint 6 independent members and only 3 government nominees. And these reforms proved quite successful because the banking sector holds in Ukraine despite all the turmoil. And the central bank this year received this award, the Central Bank of the Year. Might be also political, but I believe there is substance behind this. What changed in the supervisory board? So Ukreexim Bank has been founded in 1992. It's 100% state-owned. It's the 3rd largest bank in Ukraine. When we started working in 2019, it had 3,500 employees, 140 billion local currency hryvnia as assets under management. So basically, at this time, you had to divide by 28 to get the amount in dollars. 65% of the portfolio were non-performing loans. Basically, bad loans, people not paying or paying badly or wherever they wanted. Why? Because as a state-owned bank, not supervised, usually there is sort of personification of the state, state-owned enterprises, let's say, collusion between the power in place and the state-owned enterprises. So people were nominated by the president, or so they were relatives or people quite close to the president. And quite often, the bank would receive a call saying, Mr. Ivanov is going to visit the bank tomorrow, and please ensure he doesn't leave the bank without his loan. So of course, there is no credit analysis behind, no proper collateral management, and this is how we ended up with a huge non-performing loans portfolio. What is corporate governance? So these are, let's say, technical definitions of corporate governance. It's the idea of setting up a system of rules that are going to ensure controlling the firm, right? A more interesting definition is the OECD's definition. They don't really define what corporate governance is, but what is the purpose of good corporate governance. And good corporate governance purpose is long-term. It's trust, it's ensuring accountability, it's sustainability, ensuring that all the interests are balanced between those of the shareholder, those of the employees, those of the executives, the customers, etc. And this fosters confidence, especially in the banking sector if we speak about banks. So in June 2019, a new supervisory board was formed, and we had 3 government nominees and 6 independent. Some of them are foreigners, I'm one of them. And an interesting move from the government was to appoint people with diverse mindsets and expertise. Because the diversity is not only a question of expertise, but it's also a question of mindset. You know, a lawyer thinks as a lawyer. A CFO thinks as a CFO. An HR thinks as an HR. You know, the saying is, the CFO says, what if we invest in employees and they leave? And the HR says, what if we don't and they stay, right? There is this balance between both visions. So they ensure that we have different, let's say, skills in the bank. And I was appointed on the, let's say, operations side, which includes cybersecurity and IT supervision. And supervisory boards, we have committees. We have 3 compulsory committees by law, and we decided to create 3 other optional committees to deal with especially important problems, the NPL and the operations and digital. So my first move after we had the first supervisory board meeting in July 2019 was to spend the next day with the heads of different IT departments and the cybersecurity guy. And the first remark I got was, it's the first time a supervisory board member comes to my office and talks to me. And I think this is a very important point, because many corporations believe that the supervisory board meeting every quarter for 2 days, signing some papers, having dinner together, but staying at the boardroom is enough to supervise a company. And I think it's completely wrong. I don't believe it's possible for supervisory board to genuinely supervise a company if people never get out of the boardroom. At some point, also, the executives are going to convey the message they want to convey you, right? If you talk only to the top management, you don't really get the message from people from below, right? And in some cases, you have very fancy supervisory boards with very clever people. Like, the average of IQ is 130, but the outcome of the decisions taken together equals more to an IQ of 60, 70. We have examples like, if we take the examples of Theranos, the supervisory board was absolutely brilliant, but were absolutely not able to ensure that, the sustainability of the company and solve problems in supervising. So I spent the Operations and Digital Committee supervises IT operations and cybersecurity. And I spent probably half of my time the next 4 months, from August to November, December, talking to the operations executives, assessing the bank, going quite deep into the matters. And I think that at some point I was probably wrong. That's the difficulty to transit from executive to non-executive roles, because at some point, so we have a two-tier board, meaning what? Meaning that we have a supervisory board that is not involved in the day-to-day operations, and we have executives who are not involved in supervising the company. So the CEO cannot be a member of the supervisory board. And it's the exclusive competence of the supervisory board to appoint the CEO and the executives. So we ensure that there is no conflict of interest. And it goes through very long processes I won't describe today, but we ensure that we don't have influences from above to appoint people the state would probably want to see appointed. And I realized during my assessment that the bank was heavily underinvested in IT, and that was a catastrophe. I remember the first complaint I got from the IT executives was, well, our firewalls are PIX firewalls. They are more than 10 years old. We never changed them. The core of the network is 10 years old as well. And in fact, finance guys never give us money. We ask for money every year, and the finance never delivers any budget. Why? Because in Ukraine, the power of managing money is given to the chief accountant. The chief accountant is criminally responsible for not paying the right taxes. Accounting is looking at the past. We spent money. We have financials. We have to calculate the taxes we have to pay to the state. That's all. Finance look forward. Accounting looks backwards. And so the chief accountants are very powerful in Ukrainian corporates. The difference between God and the chief accountant is that God doesn't think he's a chief accountant, right? So, and here there is also a pattern, a problem of miscommunication between those who have money and those who ask for money. And probably there is, two-sided discrepancy because the CFO was probably not able really to understand the long-term problems of IT guys, and the IT guys were probably not really able to convey the message that, use the language of the CFO, use the language of corporates. We, as supervisory board, we focus on 3 things: bottom line, operational efficiency, and risk management. So those are the message we understand, and those are the message that should be conveyed by the executives to get some traction and trust. So the supervisory board between 2019 and 2021 set up a corporate governance framework. We drafted a new strategy, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit on the next slide. We changed the executive management and executive or management board completely. We also conducted in 2021 a full-scale audit of IT and cybersecurity capabilities of the bank. That was interesting because if you have an external opinion from external auditors, it's more difficult to be challenged. So as a supervisory board, you can still ask the executive to do something. You don't really have the power to impose something, but you might request, right? Recommend. But the executives are the ones who are going to decide. When you have an external opinion, it's written black on white, what is wrong, what is right, and what you have to do. So so it's more difficult to do some pushback in this case. And it's also more difficult from the shareholder to criticize you for investing in something, right? They might say, well, if you invest, the revenues are, the net results are smaller, and the taxes you are going to pay that go into the state budget are going to be lower. So please demonstrate that these investments made sense. And we also updated the business continuity plans. The strategy, so we reshuffled the strategy, focusing on corporates, state-owned enterprises, municipalities, and we ensure that one of the three pillars, besides solving the NPLs, of course, was to focus on operational efficiency and cybersecurity elements, because, well, they are always linked, right? We also ensure that we are going to launch value-added projects that are going to combine bottom line improvement, operational efficiency, and cybersecurity, like digitalizing the contracts, meaning that you have less paper, less physical interaction, and when you have, for instance, well, when we got COVID, you remember the joke, what? Who is the driver behind digitalization? The CFO, the CEO, the CIO, or COVID? COVID was probably the main driver behind digitalization in 2020. And by the way, it was for us, it was a good rehearsal for the future. So we added such projects like digitalizing the contracts, meaning that if you have an invader coming from the east, there is less paper to safeguard, to store, and to move, to transfer somewhere, right? And you can work remotely and get to the documents without needing a physical interaction. And the strategy was approved by the Cabinet of Ministers in December 2020. It's a very important point because after if the Cabinet of Ministers doesn't approve the strategy for two consecutive times, then the supervisory board is dismissed. And in 2023, as of today, we're number one in corporate lending. We have only 2,700 employees. We roughly doubled the assets under management, and we have only 17% of the portfolio, right, which is non-performing loans. And we very much focused on digitalization and ensuring that the IT is going to survive in the future. So as I said, in 2021, we got this analysis from external auditors, and they drafted a, let's say, 24-month plan that would be rolled out from 2022. And very quickly about the bank's results. 2021, so in 2020, we reserved a lot of credits that were never reserved. When the bank says, well, they haven't paid for 10 years, but, well, we think they are going to pay in the future. Yeah, bullshit. And we had the best operational result and the best net result for the past 29 years. And 2022 was supposed to be the same, but, well, history decided otherwise. 2021, prelude to the war, and we observed that the Russian Federation was concentrating troops at the border, and probably they were not going after the mushrooms and the berries in the Ukrainian forest. So we asked the bank to upgrade the business continuity plans. We, let's say, based our assumptions on those maps, but we're not military guys. And one of the lessons learned is that for this kind of assessments, you have also to discuss with the military, and I will explain you afterwards what we did wrong. We also asked the bank to rehearse on crisis management framework and crisis management exercises, because these are very interesting sorts of exercises. This is where you first spot people who are, let's say, playing the game. Sometimes there are people who are just, dismissive, saying, yeah, it's a game, nothing really happens. We don't really care about crisis management, right? You have other people who are more serious than that. And this is also where you identify people who are cold-headed and rational, who are those who are able to take quick decisions and rationally react to adverse elements like those we faced from February 24th. And then February 24th, it was a call for action. It's exactly like when you receive a phone call from this guy. You don't really have the choice but to go further, right? Suddenly, critical infrastructure was destroyed. So this is Irpin, which is 30 kilometers from Kiev. You don't see it here, but on the next slide, we see people hiding under the bridge, evacuating by foot. And suddenly, communications are cut. And this is the morning of February 24th. The red line is the maximum advance of the Russian troops. So they tried to establish a bridgehead here. Hostomel is like 30 kilometers from downtown. The other airport where I was supposed to land on February 24th is here. So you can see they were very, very, very close from the city center. And the first phase was to cope with the unknown unknown. And the problem of such a situation is that it's not really a crisis situation. A crisis, you have a peak of the crisis, and then you have returned to new normal. The problem with that, the situation we face in Ukraine, which stabilizes more or less today, but you never know what is going to happen tomorrow, it's exactly that. You wake up in the morning, you don't know what the situation is going to be in the evening, and you go to bed in the evening, and you don't know what the morning is going to look like. So there's a permanent adaptation. You have a new normal. Your new normal might last for hours or days or months, but for this type of new normal, you also have to build new business continuity plans. And then you have another new normal, and you have to build again new business continuity plans. The first priority was evacuating the employees, ensuring that they would be safe. So we evacuated them from the eastern regions. We relocated the head office. We closed the head office in Kiev on the 24th. We relocated to western Ukraine in Lviv. We dispatched people in different buildings because if one of the buildings is hit by a rocket, you would still have another half of the employees and executives working in another building. Well, probability, you pray that the probability is going to be well, there is less probability that both buildings are going to be hit. And one very important point, we moved our data abroad because until 8th of March 2022, the National Bank of Ukraine didn't allow banks to host their data abroad. But the National Bank understood that this was a situation, it's a matter of national security. So suddenly it was possible to move data abroad. Because one of our risks was having the head office or any other data center being shelled, data destroyed, or sabotaged by internal saboteurs, you don't ever know, or seized by the Russians, or destroyed by the Russians, if the advance if they were able to seize Kiev. As I said, we manage one risk, so less let's say, the risk of losing data was managed by moving data abroad. But now our main issue is ensuring that we are able to get data. So we now ensure that we have full internet redundancy, connection redundancies, to ensure we can get to the data. But this can change. You never know how this can change, right? Connections can be sabotaged. Starlink might be disconnected for any reason. So, as I said, it's permanent adaptation. And the roadmap supposed, among others, migration to Microsoft 365. And here, so by moving data abroad and migrating, well, migrating data abroad and migrating to M365 took us probably 2 to 2.5 months for 2,700 employees. So people were just working 24/7, and this would not have been possible without the dedication of our employees, and also without the support of Microsoft and AWS for the data. We've been heavily supported by them, and well, if there are people from Microsoft or AWS here, I thank them, I mean, from the bottom of my heart. So that was the maximum advance, but that was fast. And we didn't account for airborne operations, for instance, right? We thought that we would have several days to evacuate, that the advance would be repelled, or at least until the Dnieper, which, I mean, makes a border between Western and Eastern Ukraine, more or less. It went much faster. So this, I believe this is this sort of assessment you have to probably discuss the military or people who are specialized in those operations. So one of our mistakes was overestimating the capability of Ukrainian resistance the first 2 or 3 days. We had to evacuate, destroy cache much faster than initially anticipated. However, updating the business continuity plans helped us facing those situations much faster than we could have been without any update. So, you know, Amazon was I mean, imagine that the government put the data in those boxes, and we did the same, putting those boxes in vehicles and driving to the west, right? So huge risk. If this is shelled or spotted by the Russians, basically lose everything. An interesting story. We had this Operation Palo Alto, so we had to replace one of the firewalls at the head office in March, where data was still hosted. So we find someone. The firewall was in Dnipro. We found someone who put this firewall in a train, drove to Lviv, was configured by the employees who were now in Lviv, and then driven by motorbike to Kiev. So one of the employees was carrying this firewall in a backpack. March 6th, right? With the Russians being not very far from the roads, from the main roads. As I said, it's permanent adaptation. Suddenly, what is very interesting also is that suddenly you beat all bureaucracy. You don't need any 5 signatures anymore to take a decision. Suddenly, you take fast decisions. When it's a question of life and death, you go very fast. And at some point, we demonstrated that we can beat the bureaucracy. And at some point, this influences the way people now start working. And then situation stabilized. This was Kiev in May 2022. Peaceful, beginning of spring, beautiful, empty, because, well, the city was still empty at this point. And this stayed. So from May, we stabilized operations. We relocated again we resumed back operations in Kiev. We changed the strategy to ensure that we are going to support the Ukrainian economy and not just develop operations. And we coped with the new normal until October 10th, 2022. This is where Russia started its campaign of destroying critical infrastructure. So by the way, this crossing is 400 meters from my hotel. This is where I usually go by foot when I go by foot to the bank. So I might have been there because at this precise moment I was boarding my tramway to go to the airport to be in Kiev on October 11th. So they shelled also this children's playground which lies 100 meters. So I actually might have been there on October 10th. So they started shelling critical infrastructure, water heating production, electricity. And this is at the peak of the situation. This is how Ukraine looked like, almost completely dark, almost no electricity. So when I said that COVID was a good rehearsal, it was because employees learned how to work remotely. But in such situation, it's more difficult because employees didn't have electricity anymore at the bank, at their house, at their home. They didn't have electricity, they didn't have heating, they didn't have water for some of them. So we had to use the head office to host some of our employees who in fact came working and sleeping at the bank for several days or weeks to ensure the continuity of the bank. So again, it's coping with the new normal. And especially because we are a bank, and as a bank, we are obliged to have generators. So we were at some point a shelter for our employees as well. And this is how we ensured continuity. So yeah, we've been coping with strikes on energy infrastructure. We ensure resilience and business continuity in a permanent changing environment until it becomes outdated and we don't know what the situation is going to be tomorrow. But for instance, at some point in December, we lose the DC because the old servers didn't cope with permanent switching off and on of the electricity with the diesel generator started working instead of the main electricity providers. So we had to work with electricians to ensure the continuity of the infrastructure. And again, this illustrates the fact that if you want to ensure that backup systems work, you have to exercise, right? It's not only enough to say, well, we have diesel generators. In case of disappearance of electricity, then they are going to work. No, you have to test them because you might discover some issues you didn't think about before. I think geopolitical risks are real today, right? And now we face this. The problem of Taiwan is that it's a huge producer of semiconductors and IT equipment. Since COVID, you probably faced, guys, the problem of supply of IT equipment. If before maybe it took some days or weeks to have an equipment replaced, now it takes months, many weeks or even months to get something. And the problem is that if something serious happens between China and Taiwan, we are going to face huge issues in, say, life cycle management of our equipment. Right? As I said, we had very old firewall. We had core of the network very old as well. And if something has been broken, we just couldn't replace it in a matter of days or weeks. And I think this is something very important we have to take into account to open the discussion, to open the geopolitical risk discussion. And personally, I believe that, especially for small and medium businesses, managed services is probably the future of IT, because I don't think that such businesses are going to be able to manage their IT on their own. So what can you do now? What lessons learned beside those I described before? I think IT has to review the way they communicate with the executives and especially with the supervisory board. One very important move from the state was to appoint someone like me with cybersecurity, IT operations mentality at the board. And I don't think that it's possible nowadays to have boards without people with my mentality, focus, and capacities. I think it's absolutely essential. If it's not the case, then supervisory boards probably have to appoint or form advisory boards with subject matter experts they can ask their advice for. So again, as I said, we focus on bottom line, cost reduction, and risk management. So the way IT conveys the message to get funding, besides having an advocate at the supervisory board, is very important. Elaborate holistic value creation projects, like the one I described before, because this shows that IT is not focused only on, we're very much focused on attack and defense, but we're very, very good at, missing point. I mean, when an airline is grounded because a security certificate has not been renewed in the system and the airline is grounded for several hours, this has nothing to do with hacking. It's a question of processes, of internal management. And so we very much focus on attack and defense, but I think we also have to focus on availability of systems through, long-term sustainability and life cycle management. So such value creation projects might be very interesting into creating some trust and traction and credibility from IT, showing that, IT is not only focused on solving problems with systems, but have a global vision of the goal of the strategy of a company. Assess the business continuity plans. And again, luckily we updated the business continuity plans in 2021. Luckily, the Russians gave us some time to think about it. It was not sudden, completely sudden. And think about overseas location, especially those who are in areas where the geopolitical risks might be important or might increase. Reviewing the crisis management framework, because, as I said before, when you have cold-headed, very rational people being able to take fast decisions, this is a very heavy game changer. On February 24th, we really spotted the difference between those people completely panicked, thinking about themselves, thinking about what I'm going to do with my car and my money, and those who were like, okay, we have to do this first, second, third, evacuate people, relocate, close the head office, destroy cash, roll out the crisis management framework and the business continuity plans together. And finally, I think review the life cycle management. Because if a crisis between, or war, a long-term war between China and Taiwan breaks out, how fast are we going to be able to replace our equipment, especially that suddenly gets broken? Right? So I think we have to think about this as a long-term, as long as our states rely on Asia, on supply chain from Asia for production and let's say, supplying the equipment. We have to think about those geopolitical risks, take them into account for the sustainability of our IT systems, not focusing only on attack and defense, but on long-term stability and availability of our infrastructure. Thank you very much. If you have Q&A, please. I'll give you 10 minutes, guys.
Khaled, it's a media question, by the way. Khaled Fatal, Survivability News. I think your storyline should resonate a lot better with those who are focused on the security or the survivability of their effective competitive business. So fundamentally, to what extent are you noticing that senior management, not just at your bank, but others who you speak to, are ready to make that mind shift or mindset shift that cybersecurity alone is no longer going to do it for you? You've got to start thinking, as you said, about not just the geopolitics, but what we talk about is the infusion of cyber into the geopolitics that could actually devastate you, and you have no mitigation strategies to this. To what level are you finding that kind of a conversation, or what you're talking about today, is actually resonating with decision makers with a sense of urgency and priority?
Unfortunately, I think people still don't realize to which extent the situation is tense. And you know, we are convinced about what we are doing, right? And we think others are convinced as well. But I remember having conversations with other fellow supervisory board members, especially at the beginning of our mandate. I've heard remarks like, yeah, but IT is not that important for the bank, right? Well, yes, I understand your focus, but is that important? So I'm not sure that people really understand to which extent we rely on IT. It's like fishes. As long as they're in the water, they don't understand the importance of water. And suddenly, if you take them out of the water, they understand that it's absolutely essential. And I think no business today doesn't rely on IT, right? But unfortunately, I don't see yet this let's say, this shift.
Mindset shift.
Yes.
Yeah. Strategic.
I was assessing some supervisory board in Switzerland, for instance. A lot of supervisory boards are composed of people who are former auditors, close to or after retirement, CFOs, and lawyers. So their focus is compliance. And we know that compliance is not risk management. It's a component of risk management, but it's not risk management. So they're still very much focused on those aspects. And I think that the mentality has not shifted yet.
It's unfortunate because I think many companies are going to get devastated before they realize this, but that's the...
yes.
I think I'll defer to the next question.
Hey, good morning. My name is Troy Wells. I work at the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, and I focus on the financial services sector and systemic risk to the financial services sector. So I'm very interested in how things play out in a real-world scenario like this, obviously. Can you speak to what role, if any, risk prioritization played at the national level with regards to, like, within the financial services sector, what kind of functions, services, et cetera, were prioritized? Was there planning ahead of time? Did that planning turn out to be useful? Did it kind of go by the wayside? Yeah, any insight on that kind of topic would be great.
Yeah, so one of the focus was, of course, safeguarding the data and ensuring that data is not destroyed, right? Well, Ukraine is a good playground today for the, let's say, attack and defense, hacking. And I think that one of the focus of the government today is ensuring that they are able to play a more global role into protecting corporations, firms, right, on a national level, and not only being self-centered on their own infrastructure, but using their capacity into collaborating with other, let's say, with the private sector. Because at the end of the day, the government understands that the private sector is key for the Ukrainian economy. No jobs, no taxes, no government budget. And Ukraine solely, relies a lot today on the foreigners, on the international financial organizations, on other countries. US donations are absolutely huge for Ukraine. It's just in the perfusion. So yeah, that's the focus today. It's really safeguarding critical infrastructure and partnering, disseminating their protection and intelligence to other companies, to the private sector. But this is going to take a lot of time. It's a complete change in the mentality. It's interesting to see by how much people who are very much in the private sector, once they come to the power, they become very government-centered and forget about, they were liberals and suddenly they become like socialists, right? Because they're very much focused on, long-term re-election or just being able to, to manage state-owned enterprises and manage their power. So it's a shift in the mentality that has not happened, but it's on the way. It's in the process.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Pleasure.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Megan Gates from Security Management Magazine. I was wondering if you could talk a bit, obviously this has been an extremely stressful and long-term stressful
Exercise.
Yeah, yes, for you and your staff and everyone that you work with. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about sort of managing that and employee mental health and things that you're doing to sort of take care of yourself and your team, so you can continue to do this work.
Yeah, that's a very good question. We had a discussion with other supervisory board members about our employees who are still working abroad. And at some point, from the one hand, the situation stabilized in Ukraine, so people should be able to come back and work. On the other hand, we decided we don't want to stress them too much by putting them in the choice between staying abroad and being fired or coming back and facing the risks of being caught again in a possible turmoil if the Russian Federation decides to, to go further or increase their shelling campaigns. Especially, we don't want to see them coming back with the kids and with the families. So this is one of the aspects we've been working on. So we decided yet to, let's say, protect the employees who are working abroad. For those who are working in Ukraine, to my knowledge, so far we haven't implemented such programs. I know from other companies that they did that, especially at the beginning of the war, employing psychologists for their staff. But we haven't worked on the topic yet, because we're very much caught in the day-to-day business. But we ensure that and I finish on that. We ensure that the employees get enough support. Myself, I have been traveling across our branches since October. I've been to Lviv, I've been to Kharkiv, I've been to Kherson, where the Russians are like 5 kilometers from the city center. Probably the closest shell fell 700 meters from me when I was going to the bank. I've been to Chernihiv, which is close to the Belarusian border, to Kharkiv. I said, to support the employees, to show support and to show that they're not alone, that they get support from the foreigners, from the supervisory board as well. And I think this is one of the aspects that are important to show in terms of leadership. Thank you very much for coming.